Well, hello everyone. My name is Felipe Gonzalez. I'm the CEO of LatAm, the main seminar of international affairs and also economic of entrepreneurship and innovation that has arrived to Latin America. In this opportunity, we got a beautiful and nice partner here that is traveling here to Santiago de Chile on April 21st. Her name is Gesche Haas, and she's the founder of Dreamers and Doers. It's a highly curated community of high-achieved, trailblazing women who come together to support each other on the entrepreneurial path. The community encompasses a diverse mix of female founders, women working at startups, and other female creators, change makers, and trainers. So please, a huge welcome to Gisha.
Hi, I'm super excited to be here.
Well, when we discussed and we started talking about what kind of topics we would like to talk with you, we said that it would be wonderful if we would get to know, for example, what do you think about the Latin American ecosystem? Do you have any
Yes.
knowledge? Do you have any idea? Have you traveled to Latin America? Or this is going to be the first time you're here?
So just to give you a bit more background on my background, even
Please.
though I live in New York right now and I'm traveling from New York, I have a very international background. So my dad is German, my mom is Chinese, actually Chinese Malaysian, and I was born in Africa. So I lived in many different countries, Africa, Germany, Malaysia, Singapore, Beijing, Hong Kong, and now New York. And in terms of Latin America, so I've been to Brazil 3 times, which is kind of in that area, and I have spent a lot of time in developing countries. And also seeing, for example, living in China for 5 years, it's very interesting seeing how it differs from, call it America or from Europe. So what I think is there's so much energy in Latin America that there's a lot of opportunities there for one to learn from maybe startups in the USA and Europe, but at the same time to not copy everything one for one. So the number one mistake I have seen in, for example, Asia is that startups or local communities will copy everything exactly the same, and that's also oftentimes why the big companies will fail. So you guys have a big edge by being based locally and being in an environment that is much more nascent, much more developing.
Well, thanks. Can you please talk about your company right now?
Yes.
How
So
you
what I
started?
think is, yeah, I'll give you a rundown. What I think is, I'll start out with what I think is particularly interesting about our company. So we started out, I'm a non-technical person. And at least in Silicon Valley, a lot of people are engineers, so I think it's interesting that I'm not technical, and in a way very different because I'm not technical, not American, and in some ways because I'm a woman. And I was fortunate that we had funding offered to us, but we actually declined funding, and instead became profitable more or less 2-3 months into monetizing. So I think we have a really interesting story. So what Dreamers and Doers is, we make it super efficient and effective for entrepreneurial women to leverage each other as a resource. Right? So it was Adam Grant and Sheryl Sandberg, who's the COO of Facebook, who said that women help more but benefit less. So what we do is we make it super easy for women to help each other. And we like calling it the sharing economy 2.0. So you might have heard the term sharing economy in the context of Airbnb, in context of renting out your home or your car. So oftentimes people think of the sharing economy as fixed assets. But what we are doing is we're tapping into human capital. That's why we call it sharing economy 2.0. So instead of your home, what we're sharing is knowledge, relationships, resources, emotional support. And we really think starting out with a community of women is really important. So similar to how Facebook started out with students, Harvard, and now owns the world, we think we're starting out with entrepreneurial women, but there's this whole ecosystem that goes with it.
Okay, great. Miguel has a question for you. Maybe it's more focused on the topics that you were speaking right now. let's wait for Miguel to make the question.
Oh yes, I have a question for you. Hi, Gesche, first of all. I have a question related to your previous work. You work in a hackathon, right? How and why did you transition from that to helping women in the startup ecosystem?
Yes. So the question was how I switched from finance to the startup system.
Exactly.
And I was an investor. I was an investor at a hedge fund for 5 years, for half a decade, and I really liked it, but I didn't love it, and I didn't know what I wanted to do instead. And then I was exposed to the startup world through a really happy coincidence, and that's really showed me that it was much more aligned with my personality. So, what I love about the startup world is you're creating something from nothing, right? So it's a very different skill set and different from finance, where the number one factor tends to be money, right? That's the number one driver in finance. It's also a lot more about taking risks for things that you care about. But I think the most important thing that I learned is if you do finance or if you do any other kind of corporate job versus startups, like each path has something that is unpleasant, right? So there's so much uncertainty when you go with the startup path. But I think, for me at least, I think even though uncertainty is painful, certainty is more painful to me. So I started out working for a few venture-backed startups and doing many different roles. So everything from growth, community, business development, business operations, and you learn so much. What I learned in a year, in 2 years, 3 years, is 10 times as much as I learned in finance. And just really, really, it's much more aligned with my personality in terms of being able to build. And advice for anyone who wants to go into the startup world is to be really, really dedicated and committed. I think even more so than in when you're at a corporate job, because especially for early stage startup, they say that they hire person first and role second. So if you are someone who is very adaptable, someone who can do many different roles, and you can convince the startup that you're that way, that's, I found, is most beneficial if you're interested in joining an early stage startup. Do you have more questions? I can also elaborate more on that.
Yeah. Well, I have a question also.
Yes.
I want to put the video on so you can see me. The thing is, why did you started Dreamers and Doers? Thinking if the idea of your startup is to unify a segment of women in undividing this gender.
Yeah.
Why you're focusing on women and not focusing on entrepreneurs randomly?
It's a very good question. So Dreamers and Doers started by accident, and I was working on my first company. I was actually working on 2 different startups. And if you're a man or a woman, if you are an early stage founder, it's tough, right? You're doing many things for the first time. You're usually alone. You're figuring a lot out. There's a lot at risk. Friends, family judge you, probably rightfully so. So I never meant to start and make this a female focus, and it kind of just happened. Where, at least, like where I am, like it's harder to find other women who are on this path. But even when you find them, some of like the issues I might have might be different from men or from the other person next to me. So it was just very organic that we joined forces with other women and we organically exchanged. So the chances of success are so much higher when you have other partners, right? And similar to why Meet LatAm works, right? You learn from conference speakers, you learn from your fellow entrepreneurs. So very similar, we learned from other women. And what happened was it grew to several hundred and then to several thousand women. And so first it was offline events and then it was online. So while I was still trying to get product market fit for my other startups, I had women from all over the world reach out, and it was very obvious what a big impact it had. So, and that's a year in is when I decided to work on this full time. And so it's a great question because you're like, why are you excluding half of the market, right? you would think that as a startup you want to cover as many people as possible. But there are two reasons for that. For one, for any startup to be really successful, it's important to actually find a smaller, really, really, really committed group. So in a way, it's kind of good that it's not for the whole world, because if you create a product that every single person says, that's for me, that's actually a big warning sign. And that might eventually happen, like similar to how Facebook wasn't the first social media platform, but initially they were only for Harvard students. But the other social media platforms that existed at the time are mostly dead. So by them focusing on one segment and doing a really, really good job with that segment, they now own the world. But you need to start out with a more specific and narrow segment. The second part is it's really important that these people that you're targeting have a big problem. So the advantage of female entrepreneurs versus all entrepreneurs is it's painful being an entrepreneur no matter what. I mean, that's just a fact. But in some ways, it's even more painful of being a female entrepreneur because in some ways the odds are against us. And we can go into more detail about that, but it's an even bigger pain point. So that's why it just happened to be women, and that's why also it's been so successful so far, because there's so much demand. So we have a waiting list in the high 4 digits, and that's even without trying to grow. And that, in a way, also shows you when you have product market fit, because even without us trying, our customers are so passionate and need this so much that word just spreads. So that really helps.
That's very interesting. I have another question. This one is kind of personal.
Yes.
Being half German, half Chinese, Malaysian, and being born in Africa and traveling all over Asia and Latin America, Brazil, as you said, how do you see this being raised up this way? How do you see how does this impact you? What you do today?
Oh, very good question. I love that question. I think so much of being a founder is really important to know your superpower, right? Like actually with anything in life, but I think even more important if you're a founder, because you have much less separation between your job and what you're doing, because there's no one else telling you what to do. So it's really important that you get to know yourself well and that you work on something that you have an edge in. And sometimes those strengths are not as obvious, right? So one of my strengths that helps me be a good entrepreneur is that I see a lot of possibility and I don't judge a lot, and I'm very rebellious and I like breaking rules. And that definitely contributed by living in so many different countries, because when you see so many different people, so many different scenarios, I was from a young age used to think anything is possible, right? Not is anything necessarily better or worse, it's just different. And because of that, when I see a situation and I don't like it, I don't think that's just it. I think there's so much possibility and I can change it. And and I just don't stop in a way that persistence, right? So it's really, really important too. So having been thrown into so many different situations has really helped me just deal with difficult situations, because when I was very young, I'd have to meet new friends all the time. It was a completely new country. So in a way, it's like a mini startup. Every single time I moved, I had to figure out, like, how does this work? How do I, fit in? And it was less about, I didn't have an option. So I think that really helped me. And being an entrepreneur, a founder, you need to constantly sell. Like, you have to have usually some element of, like, people connection. Not necessarily, because sometimes there are people who are engineers and they focus more on the technical side, so that's possible too. But generally, you need to be a salesperson, even if you're the very first technical person, because you need to be able to sell your idea to yourself, to investors, to employees, to customers. So having witnessed so many different people, I've gotten also really good to become accessible to people. And I think that's also one reason that I started, that the company is so community focused, because of that nature of mine, of just being very social and good with very diverse set of people and being able to be very empathetic.
Well, I have a question here from Twitter that it
Yeah.
says, what opinion do you have about the Latin American ecosystem? Do you know something about Chile? Do you have an idea of expanding here, or opening your startup and your company here in Chile as well? Or have you focused on the Latin American market? Or is it on for a few years, or more years ahead?
Yeah. So one thing that's super important is with anything is no startups die for lack of ideas, right? Startups die for lack of focus. Like you're trying to figure out what's working, and when something's working, it's really important to stick with that for a while, right? I think that's one of the number one mistakes because stuff gets hard, so people like to move to things that are really that are different and quick. So just to preface that, at least on our end, in terms of expanding internationally, we get asked a lot. Right now, because we are mainly online, we do have people from all over the world, but at least for now, a bit more. It's like Australia, America, Europe, and that's our current focus right now. But we'll definitely, once we kind of, for lack of a better word, own those segments, we'll try to see what works and try to apply it to other countries as well. Because we think, and probably possibly other genders, because I think a lot of what we're doing, even though right now is female focused, as you said, like men might need it too, but at least this is our initial audience. Talking about Latin America in general, so a lot of people, they idealize America, where they are really excited. They're like, oh, if I was just in America, everything would be easier. I could get funding easier. I would be in an ecosystem. So I think one thing that is true is trying to find peers that are in the same, that are startups as well. So exciting is that there's a lot more things that need to be developed in a way that where in some ways the American market is very saturated. So it's an advantage because there's so much more to develop, but also you can learn it from countries that have already established certain products that might be new. And in terms of funding, because I hear, I mean, obviously I'm not based in Chile, but I hear that it can be harder to get funding, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's this company called Atlassian that is an Australian company. They never properly took funding, and they're a public company now. So sometimes it can be an advantage in a way because I know so many companies where the only reason they failed was that because they got funding, because trying to focus on that and before you build a good business model, before you're profitable, can be very dangerous. So I think there are so many advantages, and it comes down to similar to being a founder. Like you need to figure out what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses. So in Latin America, figuring out what are the advantages and disadvantages. I personally think the advantages are that it's kind of a protected market because even if outsiders wanted to come in, like being local, you have an edge. And then in some ways it's emerging. There's a lot of, I think just a lot more development happening than in the States.
That's wonderful. I have a first question for you, Gesche. I read that you talked about the startup advice given by mentors being repetitive, like predictable. How do you deal with that? How do you break that with the startups that you mentor?
Yeah. Yeah, so, okay. Here's the deal. Even though startups are super innovative, right, by definition, I think there's a certain way of doing startups, right? And some things are tried and tested, and it's good to follow it. But the mistake I made for a year was every time someone gave me advice, I just follow it, right? Like, oh, that person is smart, and I just internalize it, and I try to work really, 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 really hard. And it was good that I did it because it helped me learn what doesn't work. And so a lot of and it's really hard because each startup is different. So the number one advice I'd give is to use common sense. And so you have to be a bit of a rebel by being a founder. But I think rather than limiting it just to the ideas, it's really important to apply it to the advice as well and how you do things. Not just what you're doing, but how you're doing it. And always gut checking with yourself. Does this make sense? So generally you get the feeling being in the USA that taking funding is a really great idea, going to accelerators, that you need to have a co-founder, and so all the things that people stipulate, but to be kind of a startup within a startup is kind of figuring out what makes sense for the business that you are building and for your specific strengths. So in our case, what has worked, so we spent an entire year building out proprietary platform. I had this amazing CTO, and we got money offered to us. And because those were all the things that I thought we were supposed to do. But only when I took a step back and I was like, realized that it didn't make sense for us, and I had the courage to go without it, have things been working really, really well. So personal advice is don't be worried or scared if things don't look like as attractive to the outside, right? Because I think we all have an ego. It's normal, right? Like we couldn't even be alive today if we didn't have some sort of ego. But it's especially important when building a startup to keep your ego in check, because you need every little aspect of you to be focused on winning. And having an ego involved will make you do decisions that might be better for your ego but not best for your company. And especially if you're starting out very early on, you just have to keep the ego out, because there's so many, literally you're doing so many things for the first time. You're going to suck at so many things. So many people are going to judge you because your vision is so big, but what you have right now is so small. So it's very easy and very tempting to go the ego route, and that might involve raising funding too early or focusing on vanity metrics. So an example of vanity metrics would be, hey, social media followers, or how many press mentions you're getting, or how often you're speaking at a conference. So all those things are very visible, and they make you look very cool. But oftentimes that's not the best thing that's for your company. So really thinking hard about what milestones and what goals are going to get you there, and consciously trying to suck at something. So wanting to be bad at certain things, and kind of deciding what those things are that you want to be bad at. And if you're not doing anything that you're getting judged for, then you're definitely doing something wrong. That's the only time you should judge yourself. If everyone loves everything you're doing, then something is off. Like the most successful ideas, moonshots, biggest, most successful ideas were companies that people thought were completely crazy at the time. And the reason for that is, if everyone loves it, probably multiple people are doing it, and it's too obvious in a way. So for companies that can be complete outliers, it's usually companies that people think you're completely crazy.
Well, I'm going to ask you the last question. This is my favorite one, and it's personal as well. In terms of your experience, what do you think is the principal, the most common mistake that entrepreneurs do? And which one, up to the date, are you still committing?
Wow, it's a tough one. I think that there's so many mistakes, yeah, I mean, the number one was, I actually briefly touched upon it, was the advice thing, and that more doesn't equal more. So when I started out, I spent 2 years optimizing every second of my life to work more, because I thought I gave up this nice finance job. I first took a 70% pay cut to work in startups, and then I took a 100% pay cut, right, to work on my own thing. And I'm really determined in terms of I just want to win and make this successful. So I thought if I work every single second, I'm going to be more successful, right? I thought that was logical. So for 2 years, I didn't work out. For 2 years, everything I did was only directly related to the startup, and it was I learned the hard way that that's not the best way to succeed. And so I think sometimes forgetting that you're so focused on winning that you forget that at the end, we're humans, right? And in the end, we're doing this for ourselves. So not forgetting ourselves in the process. And the beautiful part of that is that if you put yourself first, it doesn't mean that your company will be less successful. It will be more successful. Because you being in a good mental state makes you, everything you do are decisions, right? Even if you're startup or not startup, your life is a result of decisions, but especially if you have a startup. Every single day, there are a million directions that you could go, and there's no right or wrong answer. It really depends on what goals you have, and the goals that you have depend on your personality and your upbringing. So not forgetting that, and finding ways to be in tune with that. And that also answers your question, would I still commit? I still do that. Like sometimes I work too long, and when I work too long, I'm so tired that I'm too tired to force myself to go to bed. I'm not sure if you've experienced that before, but it'll be like 2, and because I passed a certain state where I don't have the willpower anymore, it'll be like much longer. So what I do right now is I set an alarm clock to stop working at a time. And I'm doing it not because I'm lazy, or I'm not doing it because I don't care about winning. I'm doing it because in a very rational way, I know I will perform better if I don't forget that the human part of it is the most important part of the startup in the end.
Well, that was a really good and nice message. Well, can you have another message you can send to the Latin American community that is waiting for you
Yes.
to wrap up this great interview?
Yes. I think being in Latin America, you're in a very, very exciting time and a very, very exciting part of the world. The number one thing I'd pay attention to is, in some ways, the media, like the news, is very dominated by press, probably like in the USA. I'm guessing, like, right? You're probably all on Facebook. We're all on Google right now, which are all companies that were started in San Francisco, or at least now are based in San Francisco. So similarly, taking a step back, and just because those are the successful, at least seemingly successful companies and most visible companies, not taking everything one for one, right? Like your edge is not going to be to try to imitate Google and Facebook. Like you can learn from them, but your edge is going to be to do things your way, but in a smart way that makes sense. So the number one advice I have is succeeding by kind of figuring out what makes your country, your city, and yourself different, and not getting too distracted by what's really like prominent and what everyone else is talking about. And even though that might seem like it's a more exciting thing, it's much more exciting to win. And if you're in it to win it, like trying to find what your advantages and your competitive edge are.
Great, great. Well, thank you very much for your time, and we're waiting for you here on April 21st. So thank you, thanks a lot, and thanks the community to participate in this interview and this live streaming.
Thank you, everyone. It was great talking to you.
Thank you. See you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.